A limited nuclear war. How does that sound for you? Does that sound like something you want to be rolling the dice on? No matter who we're talking, they are, whether it's the United States, Russia, China, somebody else in the future, even that should horrify anyone. The very thought of any kind of use of nuclear weapons should be terrifying. I remember in some of my research that I did even before the Russia-Ukraine war started, in looking at how past American presidents had dealt with Soviet intransigence, et cetera. And I remember in the 1956, when the Soviets rolled tanks into Hungary, that President Eisenhower and then Vice President Nixon said, yeah, we feel really bad for them, but there's no way on God's earth we're going to risk a nuclear war with the Soviet Union over something like this, because they were still just, a handful of years away from observing the use of nuclear weapons, and they were rightfully horrified by it. And as time went on in the Cold War, especially in those first number of decades, people remained all the way up through the the rule of the U.S. president. All the U.S. presidents, really, up until the 80s, they were still. Reagan was in particular. We've had one of his aides on our show before who said he was rightfully still terrified in the 80s of the possibility of nuclear weapons, and that's the right thing to do. It's exactly what you're supposed to do. We seem to have lost some of that today, and I've hesitated to have this episode on today. But I think it's something of vital importance that people understand. And I've got the absolute subject matter expert to help us break this down today, and that is MIT Professor Ted Postol, Professor of Science, Technology, and National Security at the MIT. Professor, welcome back to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, listen, I as we talked about a little before we came on air today, I'm grateful and excited to have you on the show today, but I'm also a little bit afraid and terrified as to the ramifications of some of the stuff that you're going to be sharing with us today. But I want to set the stage a little bit before we get into the technicalities and some of the philosophies behind the use of nuclear weapons from the United States, from Russia, and what they may or may not do, because you're going to show us, kind of in some depth as to what the philosophy is that the Russians use, which is different than what our imaginations are and what we think things are. And I think it's really important to understand that. But first of all, I want to show people that what I said at the outset here, my concern that we've lost a proper fear of nuclear weapons. And first of all, in the beginning, about, 7 months into the Russia-Ukraine war, Zelensky was interviewed by it, and he was asked about one of the saber-rattling comments from Russia at that time. They were asked, what are your thoughts on this? Here's what he said.
Do you think that President Putin is capable of launching nuclear weapons, of using them?
Якщо я скажу, наприклад, що вони не спроможні
If I say, for example, they are incapable of using nuclear weapons, then an inadequate person who has this power in his hands will say, oh, really? I can't? Well, here, see how I can, and therefore use it. Now, if I say he can use it, it can cause panic moods in many countries, including Ukraine. All that Putin is afraid of, it's not even a nuclear strike. He's afraid of his own society. He's afraid of his own people, because only these people can replace him.
Okay, I think Ted, in the categories of, are you afraid of being deposed or maybe voted out of office or being subject to a nuclear strike, I'm thinking that the electoral is not quite as concerning. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I think the person who is afraid of his constituents is Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky, as of a few days ago, was no longer a duly elected official, for his country. He declared military law, and he suppressed all the alternative political parties in Ukraine, and he's now he doesn't even have the fig leaf of having been elected earlier, because he suppressed the election. So I think he should be, and almost certainly is, very afraid of his own position. As for Putin, I think Putin is an extremely careful, strategic, and measured decision maker. And I have no doubt that under the appropriate circumstances, and I'll try to discuss that he would and could use nuclear weapons. I was very interested listening to an interview with John Mearsheimer, who I greatly respect. And at one point he said during the interview that, and this is Mearsheimer speaking, he has no doubt that under appropriate circumstances, Russia could use nuclear weapons. And I agree completely with John on that. And I'll describe that.
We actually had John on our show, and I asked him that same point blank question. He's had the same immediate point blank answer, as did Ambassador Chaz Freeman. So the people who have the most sober recognition realize that we're not talking some theoretical possibility or self-deterring, as many people are saying these days.
Well, I can explain, and I think it'll be fairly obvious and logical how one scenario of many where it's very clear that nuclear weapons within this, recognizing the risk of an uncontrolled escalation could make military sense and could also make sense in stopping an adversary from responding, putting an adversary in a position where they would not want to respond. And I'll give you that example.
Yeah. And before we get there, though, I want to just show a couple of examples. First of all, what some in the United States think, and you're going to recognize some of these. You may recognize all of them. And we're also going to hear from Putin himself to kind of bolster your position here. But first of all, this was on May 8th. And now the context here, this is Senator Lindsey Graham in a Senate chamber. And he's asking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff an issue about, this is related to the Israeli-Hamas fight, but he's using the context of a nuclear escalation, a nuclear weapon use to justify his position here. Watch this.
Would you have supported dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, General Brown, to end World War II?
Well, Senator, I think it is based on the situation where the...
Well, we know. I mean, it's happened. We know. I'm not asking that they did it. Do you think that was disproportionate?
It was definitely...
Well, do you, in hindsight, do you think that was the right decision for America to drop 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities in question?
Well, I'll tell you, it stopped the World War.
Okay, so Israel's been hit in the last few weeks by Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, dedicated to their destruction. And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews? And you're telling me that if we withhold weapons in this fight, the existential fight for the life of the Jewish state, it won't send the wrong signal?
Okay, so now, first of all, I'm not going to go into the ramifications of his ridiculous claims that everybody in the Middle East is trying to destroy Israel and like there's some victim that can only use this. But what I want to talk about right now is his illusion, even at the end of that, implying that maybe Israel could even use a nuclear weapon, which it's the worst kept secret on the planet that they have a nuclear arsenal here. But that was on the 8th of May. Just a few days later, he got even more emphatic and more enthusiastic about nuclear weapons. Check this out.
Why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat war? Why was it okay for us to do that? I thought it was okay. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state.
Senator, again, military officials say the technology has changed. But let me ask you about how all
these
of this
military
could
officials
impact.
that you're talking about
Let me ask you
are
something.
full of crap.
Wow. He's like almost like a lusting enthusiastic about the previous use of nuclear weapons, and it's inherent. It's very clear. He would not think it's a problem at all to do it again in the future. What do you think when you see this kind of casual talk about nuclear weapons?
Well, first of all, it's a shocking display of total ignorance. It's not only a shocking display of total ignorance in terms of the implications of nuclear use in the case of Israel. More importantly, it's a shocking display of total ignorance with regard to the decision to drop atomic bombs at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the United States was contemplating an invasion of Japan. Of course, as you know better than I as a soldier, it's very hard to know what your casualties could ever be. But it was certainly uh, thought that it could involve millions of casualties, both U.S. soldiers and also Japanese, who the Japanese were in a horrendous suicidal state. And and at some point there is a humane uh, component to a decision, even in a war like that. So we were looking at the possibility of an invasion that could have cost us millions of soldiers and the Japanese many millions of civilians. And there were significant, serious debates that went on inside the US government, unlike Mr. Graham seems to be aware of, about ways of trying to avoid dropping the bomb. But it was ultimately decided to drop the bomb because the expectation was, and it turned out to be correct, that we could shock the Japanese into surrendering and avoiding a catastrophic invasion that would have resulted in the deaths of many millions of people. Hundreds of thousands died, hundreds of thousands of innocent people died in the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But a much greater loss in life would have occurred for sure if we had chosen to invade. Now, there's a much longer, subtle history that I won't go into here, but Mr. Graham doesn't seem to know anything about the history of the U.S. situation.
Yeah.
And by the way, because, and I think a lot of your audience will be shocked when I say this, I have tried very hard to place myself in the position of an American scientist involved in the atomic bomb project. I knew a bunch of the people involved, literally personally, from seminars I had with them at MIT. There were a whole bunch of them. And I have reluctantly, and I say reluctantly, come to the conclusion that if I had been in the situation they were in at the end of World War II, I would have advocated for the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm not saying this is a good decision. I'm not saying this is moral, but I would have looked at the situation and said, we can't lose millions of more people, and it's better to try to keep the number of dead very much lower. And that's where I would have been. Although I would like to make it clear that the reasoning behind my decision and what Mr. Graham misrepresents as the justification for dropping the atomic bomb in 1945 is miles apart. There's nothing to do with a reasoned, thoughtful process.
Right, yeah. There's clearly the absence of that from him.
Yes.
Now, I want to jump over to what Putin himself says, because that's going to inform a lot of what follows from your presentation here later. And this is kind of following the steps of what you can describe Putin a minute ago as being a very thoughtful, rational leader here. And sometimes people may get the idea that, hang on, it's irrational to use nuclear weapons. So that's almost a contradiction of terms. But first of all, I want to look at what he actually has to say, and then we'll talk about it on the backside.
They must ultimately understand that we also have weapons, and they know about it. Just as I said, we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory. All of this really threatens conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand this?
So what you have on the one hand with Lindsey Graham is just this wild-eyed, almost lust to use it, and then at least on the other side, on this one, you see a potential willingness to use it, but you also see a recognition, a conscious recognition of the catastrophic results. And in other clips, I've seen him say he emphatically points out there would be no winners. So he doesn't even hypothetically theorize that he would come out on top. He thinks that everyone would lose, but he would still be willing to use them. I wonder if you can explain that.
Well, I think Putin is again an extraordinarily intelligent and well thought out and well informed individual, And it's very clear if you look at his numerous statements, similar to the one you just saw, but each one subtly different, that he has a great concern that American leadership, under some conditions in the future, the unknowable conditions, I think he's quite clear on that, could make a decision to try to use nuclear weapons against Russia. I think he's very clear when you look at the sum of his statements. And what he's trying to do in all of these statements is simply say, don't think of it. Don't even dare, because I understand it will be the end of the world. And you should understand that too. But you should also understand that however a tragic outcome it would be, I will end the world if you attack us, because that will be the outcome anyway. And I will be forced to do it in spite of my desire to avoid it at all costs. And later, if we have time, I'll show you a nuclear weapon system that Putin made, Putin decided for Russia to make. It's an underwater unmanned submarine. I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about it here, but perhaps in another discussion. But it's very clear to me that Putin understands completely that the end of the world would occur, and I agree with him, if one or the other side used nuclear weapons and it led to a general escalation to nuclear war between us. And
but now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also going to argue here shortly that I think it's called escalate to de-escalate, that he could use a tactical nuclear weapon with the hope of preventing strategic nuclear weapons. Is that accurate?
That preventing an escalation to general nuclear war.
Okay,
it's
right. So that's the part.
Gamble.
Yeah, it is a gamble, but that's the part I really want to zero in on, because I think that's the least understood of the West in general, maybe even most people, not even just the West, because there's this thought, the mutually assured destruction, which most everybody's heard of. The assumption is that once one nuclear weapon is used, then that's it, game over for everybody. But it at least there's a gamble that the Russian may be playing, that it might not be that way, which could be a positive thing here. But before we get into that, one last thing here, we have former 3-star Army General Ben Hodges, who I've shown here many times, just completely scoffs at the idea. Says, of course, Putin will never use nuclear weapons. In other forums, he's actually said zero chance he'll use nuclear weapons. And he gives part of that answer here to CNN.
Putin has threatened to use nukes more openly than he ever has in his speech that he just gave, warning of the destruction of civilization. Those were his exact words. How serious is this to you?
Well, of course you have to take him serious, because he doesn't care about how many innocent people might be killed. But I think this is a continuation of his style of using threats, bluster, because he sees how we overreact every time. There's no upside for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon, zero. Our president has told them that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. So really, for the Kremlin, their nuclear weapons are most effective when they don't actually use them, because we deter ourselves, we overreact.
Is he right? Do we self-deter improperly?
Well, in my job as an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, I worked routinely with 3- and 4-star admirals, and also Air Force generals, because we were interacting with the Air Force all the time on nuclear weapons questions. And I'm sorry to say that General Hodges showed a high level of military ignorance on this question. He's a military officer. I'm going to be hard on him. He's a military officer, and he doesn't know anything about politics. That's clear from his statements about the political situation. And what's more worrisome to me is he doesn't know anything about the military situation with nuclear weapons. And that is not excusable. So to parade around as an expert because you were a 3-star Army general and make the statements he's made is really, in my view, it's immoral, because he's claiming expertise on a very important survival question without the knowledge, because I will show that he's wrong. And incidentally, I hope you will consider inviting him on your program to talk with me about this, because I'll be happy to do it, right in front of an audience where he can be judged on the basis of what his knowledge is, because
Yeah,
I'll be happy.
something tells me he wouldn't accept that invitation, but I would be willing to offer it though.
Well, I hope you will. I have worked with many 3 and 4-star generals, and some of them have been absolutely impressive people that lead me to have nothing but confidence in them. And there have been some, and unfortunately, I think General Hodges is going to fall in this category. You look at them and you shake your head and you wonder how they were allowed to get to such positions of responsibility, because they
Right.
haven't thought through, and they haven't taken the trouble to inform themselves. That's my position with General Hodges.
Okay,
He's
so
happy
right
to
now
show.
we're gonna ask you to basically treat us to the
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
information that you've given these generals in the past, and kind of educate us. So if anybody is not aware of things,
Yeah.
we're about to find this out. One of our guests here, and I think in your presentation, you're actually going to talk in some detail about the unmanned sub, right? You're going
If
to
I
talk more
can,
about that.
if we have time. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, let's just jump right into it. Now, I know you got a presentation here. Start off with us talking about this whole escalate to de-escalate, because I've heard that phrase a lot, but I don't know that there's a lot of people that have a real understanding of what that actually means from the Russian perspective. So let's start there.
Well, this idea of escalate to de-escalate really came out of Russian military thinking in the mid to late 1990s, when the Russian military had completely collapsed and Russia was on the ropes. It had an economic collapse. The military was in complete disarray. And military leaders were concerned about how Russia could protect its borders, because at that point, Russia was vulnerable to literally a land invasion at that time, because the Russian forces were so weak. And they came up with this idea that under only certain circumstances, those circumstances would be that the survival of the Russian state was at risk. In other words, their survival of the whole state was at risk, presumably due to a very effective and aggressive incursion at their borders. Perhaps, I don't know what they were thinking, but one of the things I was thinking of is similar to Operation Barbarossa, which occurred in World War II, where the Germans really almost wound up taking Moscow. In fact, they might have actually succeeded if they had started their that invasion earlier, if they weren't so anxious to destroy the Greeks after there was an uprising in Greece. So if they had started earlier, before the winter set in, they might have wound up taking Moscow. I don't think they would have necessarily won, but the consequences for Russia would have been tremendously worse. So it's hard for me to know, but it seems to me that this, and of course they have Napoleon before that, and and Russians have a strong sense of history, unlike Americans, and they have they remember these things, and I would too if I were Russian. So they came up with this idea that if their state was threatened with destruction, that they might use nuclear weapons in a very, very limited way. I want to underscore, it's a limited use of nuclear weapons to cause the adversary to pull up short and stop what they're doing. So the question is, what would an attack like that look like? And I'll explain it. I'll talk a little bit about, well, a lot about how it would play out on the battlefield. Incidentally, Dan, I invite you to interrupt and challenge me, as you have all this combat experience, because I'm going to make some claims based on my assessment from talking with many soldiers that could be wrong, and you may have something to add to what I'm saying.
I will do so if we get there.
I would appreciate it very much, because I'm interested in learning. And so let me just start out with the slide 2 in the presentation. Gary, can you give me slide 2? Okay, great. Here's an obvious photograph. These are Leopard tanks advancing in a formation. In the next slide, slide 3, I'll show you what a notional armored formation might look like in an attack. All right, so here, these little triangles or elongated boxes, each one represents a tank. And you see that there are these vanguards, rows of tanks in a relatively small area, a couple of thousand yards. That's, really a mile and a quarter, mile and a half spread out. And you would, if you were a military officer and you were charged with the mission of breaking through the front line of enemy forces, you would have no choice. This is not a choice. You would have to mass, if the enemy defenses were robust, you would try to choose a place in the enemy lines of defense where you think it's weak enough, and you would try to concentrate your firepower and forces into a small area and punch through the defensive lines. Now, in these modern mechanized forces, the way they tend to be set up is you have a defensive line where you have a large amount of your teeth and claws of your military capability. You have your tanks, your infantry, people, anti-tank weapons, people with anti-tank weapons themselves. If you're like the Russians now, you would have air power, which they now have. But what you would basically be trying to do is overwhelm the local forces and punch through the line of defense. Once you punch through the line of defense, you would have a hole in the lines. You would, of course, have to have forces following through. Those forces following through would have to protect your flanks. So some significant number of forces would be required to keep the adversary from closing in from both sides on your flanks. And you would pour these forces into the rear of the enemy's area, and they would spread out right and left as relative to this diagram, and they would cut off the soft munitions supply capabilities of your adversary. So basically, it's like grabbing your adversary by the throat and strangling them. So if you can get those, punch through that line, and then exploit the areas behind the defenses, you can basically cut off the tremendous amount of munitions that is being used by the front lines, and basically starve them while you then pursue your attack.
Right.
In
Yep.
other
I can
areas of
confirm
defense.
that as a former armor officer, I definitely planned on those and exercised some of those very kinds of breakthrough moments. So I totally
Right.
concur with that so far.
Yeah, so that's the obvious. I don't want to trivialize it. The art of executing this is tremendous, and I just want to take a moment to talk about the military art here, which I am not a personal. I haven't benefited from the personal experience of that, but I know a lot of soldiers, and I've talked to them, and I'd be very interested in Dan's reaction to my description of a competent military officer who would be leading this kind of commanding this kind of military effort. You should think the way a non-expert should think about a military officer is like a coach for let's say, a national winning basketball team. The coach knows the capabilities of each of his players or her players. He knows the capabilities of the adversary's players. He knows what the adversary is good at and where they're not good, that is to say, where they have weaknesses. He knows where his own team has weaknesses and strengths. And it's this enormous skill which comes from a deep knowledge of the whole process of a basketball game and strategies required to win it, or it could lead to a loss, that comes together in this human being we call a coach. And we have a similar situation with officers who are trained in combat. You just can't take some bright 20-year-old and make him a colonel and put him in charge of forces and expect, no matter how bright he is, to know how to manage these forces. And I think that's one of the big problems that Ukraine has had, because they didn't have the cadres of well-trained officers. Would you agree with my?
Yeah, I can tell you, I make that point emphatically all the time. You can't just, you can print dollars, you can build, bombs and whatever. You can't build trained troops. You have to grow them at a 1-to-1. You can't accelerate it. You can hurry it up only on the margins. But yeah, if you don't spend years preparing, you just can't make that up on the fly.
Yeah, it's just experience and knowledge. I mean, so you would have to be a junior coach and whatever.
Yeah.
So in slide 4, I basically lay out what the issues are. Give me the next slide there. What's going to happen, as I'll describe it, is I will describe the consequences of an extraordinarily limited nuclear attack. I want to underscore, it's a single nuclear weapon. It's a very low yield nuclear weapon, 1 kiloton, thermonuclear though. I'll explain what I mean by thermonuclear. And that thermonuclear weapon would be very limited in size. The video clip is showing the fireball from an enormously larger nuclear weapon. That's the importance of this video, is it shows you a phenomenon called the fireball. And I will discuss this fireball. There it is again. I will discuss this fireball, which is a phenomenon associated with the detonation of all nuclear weapons, no matter what their yield. In this case, it's a very large fireball because the yield of this weapon is 10,000 kilotons, whereas the weapon that I'm talking about is a 1 kiloton weapon. So I'm talking about a pinprick relative to the kind of weapon that is being shown on the video. Now, let me just show you the consequences in slide 5 of what this very limited attack would be. Here I show various radii at which the effects of neutrons and gamma rays.
Hey, Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but when you say 1 kiloton, compare that with the what was the size of the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
The one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki Hiroshima was 12.5 kilotons. The one dropped on Nagasaki was 22 kilotons.
Okay.
And this one is 10 or 20 times lower yield.
Got it. Okay.
And you'll see, as I'll show you, don't assume it's a non-problem, right? As I'll show you. Okay, so I have these series of lines. They're labeled. If anybody again wants slides from me, I'll be happy to send them slides so that they can look at these things. These are calculations I've done myself, so I know they're solid. The outermost curve, shows you the range at which 100 rads of radiation would be delivered to tank crews. When I say tank crews, I mean these crews, they're inside a tank. They enjoy a significant amount of protection from gamma rays because the tank armor absorbs not all the gamma rays, but a significant part of the gamma ray flash from the thermonuclear weapon. But they offer almost no protection to neutrons. And the thermonuclear weapon has a tremendous pulse of neutrons that are radiated. And these neutrons are very, very high energy. They're 14 million electron volt neutrons, and they do tremendous damage to the biological systems of humans and all other animals that have standard cell structures. The 100 rad dose is not enough to kill these people either instantly or in the long term. However, it will immediately, within a few hours or minutes, they will start feeling nauseated and they will start vomiting. They will have symptoms that will not, to them, be very different from the symptoms experienced in the inner circle, where the people get 100 times more radiation. You see the radiation level drops off very fast. So those 5 tanks at the middle of the circle get 10,000 rads of radiation. And these troops immediately experience disorientation, vomiting, dizziness, and they will die very quickly.
Now, Professor, that's from the radiation, but what about from the blast itself? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, the
I will be
immediate
talking,
response.
Yeah, there will be blast, and the blast will be a significant part of what happens, but the big effect will not be the blast, but the flash of light from the fireball, which Gary showed you in a film clip. There's another film clip we'll see. In that film clip, in the second film clip that Gary will show, you will see immediately that the whole field of view of the camera is overwhelmed. And that's because the light from the fireball completely overwhelms the camera.
And what size blast is this right here?
That was so bright. And that bright fireball burns people and sets fire to materials around it. And I'll explain.
And what size blast is the one we're seeing right here? What size?
This blast is a 15 kiloton weapon, which could be launched from a cannon. In fact, I think you said earlier, you raised the question. This is a cannon shot where a 15 kiloton weapon was launched from, I think, a 240 millimeter howitzer. I think that's right.
Yeah,
and,
I believe that is right.
And so on the ground, notice there's a pedestal of black dust. If you were in that area, which stretches out to about a range of about 15 pounds per square inch, which is accompanied by, let's say, a 300 mile per hour wind or 400 mile per hour wind, overturned vehicles and things, light vehicles, not tanks. You will not see anything. You'll be in that pedestal. So everybody will be essentially blind. I mean, there'll be a dust, it won't be a dust storm. They will not be able to see anything around them. So all they will know is that they're in the dark until the wind pulls that dust away. And the major point I'm going to be emphasizing here as I go through a different phenomenology is that no one, either the officers in the distance or the officers on the scene, will have any idea of what happened. And the tank crews at the limit where they received doses of radiation that made them initially sick, but wouldn't kill them in the long run if they have medical attention. These tank crews at the further range, the people in the tank crew don't know where exactly this nuclear weapon detonated. It could have detonated much closer to them or not. They would not know. All they would know is there was an incredible flash of light, and then all of a sudden there was nothing but dust around them, and they're feeling ill, and they're vomiting, and they're dizzy, and they're sick. So everybody in this formation is potentially dying as far as they can tell. So this is havoc on a scale that essentially encompasses all of the tank crews. And incidentally, the tank crews are much more protected from the physical effects than the infantry around them.
Yeah.
Because if this is a combined arms operation, there will be infantry working around the tanks to provide them with cover from anti-tank weapons, and the tanks and the infantry will be working together to effectuate the breakthrough. So let me just go to the next slide, number 6. Here is a man who's dying from radiation sickness. You'll notice his teeth look red because he's bleeding from the gums. He has these spots on his skin. That's because he's bleeding from underneath the skin. The effects of radiation illness are both short-term and long-term. This man is dying probably days or weeks after his exposure. So he's what a tank crew members are going to look like in days or weeks, depending on how close they were to the detonation point. These are people who are going to be casualties. It's not even clear how you would treat these casualties. Typical numbers for survival rates assume some significant level of medical care.
Is there, in fact, speaking of that, is there any medical care that can, I guess, mitigate these or save the people, or is it just that once you've been exposed, that's it?
Well, if you're exposed and you can have bone marrow transplants and blood transfusions, and you're not exposed to maybe 500 or 600 rads. Let's say you had a 100 rad explosion, and you had bone marrow transplants and convalescent time, you would have a reasonable chance of surviving, although you'd never be the same. You'd never be a normal, well person. If you had 500 or 600 rads, which would be the circle immediately next to the outermost circle in the chart, you would die with a high probability unless you had the full benefits of transfusions. And so if you look at the outermost curve here, if you look at the next inner curve, you would be getting maybe 300 to 500 rads of radiation, and you will die with a very high chance within weeks or days of your exposure.
So what you're describing here is a 1 kiloton blast. Is that typical of Russian tactical nuclear weapons, or do they have different weights?
They could choose a 10 or 15 kiloton, but I'm arguing that this is a very, very, very low yield attack because they want to show that they're not serious about escalating. They're trying to say to you, stop. This is serious. You must stop your offensive now. So before this thing escalates out of control and we're all dead. So if you could, let's shift on over to the philosophy behind it, the escalate to de-escalate. Give us some idea of what that might look like on the battlefield. Let's say, for example, I don't know if it's whether NATO troops are have been involved and they decided that they're going to take the risk and send some French troops or some Lithuanian troops or Polish, etc., and they start actually making progress. Do you think, based on what you know about their doctrine, that it would require Russian from where they are right now to be pushed back, or would there be any circumstance where they would even do so before they begin to lose territory? Well, fortunately, I think this scenario mostly applies to a situation where they are losing and they believe that the loss will threaten the survival of their country. So, for example, if you had NATO troops introduced into Ukraine now, and there was a local breach of Russian defensive lines, I don't think this would be a likely scenario because the Russians could deal with it because they have enormous material and troop number and fighting power superiority. So I think the result would be the destruction of the NATO forces, even if they broke through, by a very, very, very capable Russian army, which has already won the war. The war is lost. Those of your audience who read the regular Western press may not understand that, in spite of the fact they're responsibly trying to keep informed. But the Western press has misreported the current situation. The war is over. It's only a matter of time how and when the Russians will declare victory. They have defeated the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has lost well over 500,000 casualties. It's been reduced to 1/2 or 1/3 of its original size. The soldiers coming in, the soldiers that the Ukraine has immorally forced into the military on short notice will be butchered when they go to this will be young people and older people who will be butchered almost immediately because the training you need to survive combat in the current environment in this war between Ukraine and Russia requires a tremendous amount of skill and knowledge of what you're going into. There are drones all over the place. There are significant heavy artillery attacks against you. There are aircraft that are in complete control of the air, dropping very high yield bombs on your defensive positions. And you really
Right,
have
Ted.
no
You know,
chance.
I had actually towards that end, I had heard some comments, not comments, reports rather, this past week to where there were some of these forcibly mobilized Ukrainian men who were grabbed on one day and 4 days later were at the front dead. So that just shows that there was literally no training for some of these going on. But I wonder if you, in light of your comments there,
It's
I
murder of
wonder
your
if
own people.
there's something that would seem to a lot of eyes to be incongruent with what they hear, because they, again, to the Western press, they say, okay, but the U.S. just passed this big bill. There's now, billions of dollars of stuff going in there. The Ukraine side just had this mobilization thing, and 500,000 people are going to be mobilized. So as soon as these weapons get in there and these people have it, then things will start changing. What do you say to that? And added to it, the request by British and even some now in the United States that ATACMS and others things allow Ukraine to fire farther into Russia. Won't that change anything?
Well, I think first of all, the Ukrainians are already committing war crimes on a regular basis. I'm not trying to say the Russians haven't done such things. I mean, war crimes are very unfortunately a part of war, and both sides should do as much as they can to control that. But both sides have engaged in war crimes. The war crimes the Ukrainians have been engaging in are due to the leadership in Kiev, because there have been artillery attacks against Donetsk, against civilians in Donetsk, where artillery shells with submunitions, which are designed to kill and injure soldiers in the open. There have been artillery attacks in Belgorod, which is why why Putin said there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine from the north, because he's trying to create a zone where the artillery cannot reach, where Ukrainian artillery cannot reach civilian areas in Belgorod. So it's a very bad situation, and the Ukrainian leadership has unambiguously had a strategy of trying to push the Russians into escalating in order to create a problem that the West might have to deal with, the Western allies might have to deal with. This is an extraordinarily reckless thing to do. And if it weren't for the fact that Putin and the Russian military have not allowed themselves to be provoked, I would expect that there would have been an escalation by the Russians much earlier. I'm pleased to know that on the Russian side, the military and political leadership is so sound-minded. I don't have to agree with. I'm not saying I agree with them or admire them. I'm saying
right,
because it's reckless what the West is doing, and it's reckless what Ukraine is doing, and it's reckless.
So now, how do you respond to those people that say, "Yeah, but look, Ukraine's fighting for their lives and for their country,
Well,
and
they
so
are fighting
they're
for
going to
their lives.
mobilize people, and they're going to bring more Western aid in, and it's starting to come online, but soon it's going to be coming in larger deal, and that's going to turn around." How do you answer those questions or those statements?
My simple question is Senator Graham, are you willing to trade Washington for Kiev? You think that's worth it? You think it's worth losing Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, Georgia, Atlanta, all, you do think it's worth, if you think it's worth it, I think you should make a clear statement that you do, because that's what escalating in Ukraine means. And we have to make a decision, which I think it shouldn't be a decision to even make because it should be obvious, whether the outcome in Ukraine is more important than the survival of Western Europe, which will certainly be hit as well if we bring about a general escalation that leads to general nuclear war.
Right, but I'm at the moment I'm
Yeah.
not talking about the nuclear part, which
Yeah.
we'll hit secondly. But your comment a second ago was that you said Ukraine has past tense lost the war already, and many of the advocates for the Ukraine side say, "Oh, but it's still going on because all these new weapons are about to come back online, and that will change." So, how do you address when they claim that in your
First of all, there are
claims?
very few nuclear weapons. I mean, there are very few conventional weapons really coming online. A lot of these things have already been destroyed. The United States has sent in all kinds of materials that were not paid for, and they're now shoring up the bills with this money. But secondly, even if this new materials came in, for example, who's going to operate any tanks? There's a small number of tanks coming in. Who's going to operate the tanks? These conscripts who can barely carry a rifle? I mean, they've lost so many soldiers that they have no ability to fight except with the more experienced soldiers who have largely been chewed up as casualties or deaths and who are continually being chewed up. The Ukrainians are losing 1,000 soldiers or more, some days 1,500, to the massive artillery and aircraft attacks of the Russians against Ukrainian forces. It's a massacre out there, even when the forces have equipment and when they're relatively well trained. Sending in additional forces who are not trained also just means that it's like giving a 10-year-old child a tank to operate, who has no idea how to use the gun, who has no idea how to tactics to prevent themselves from being seen and targeted, how to identify enemy threats. There's no hope for these people.
So, and obviously, I certainly agree with that. As we argue that the military component really has already played out, and it's just like I said, some call it a dead man walking. So they continue to fight, but the end is determined already. In the last few minutes we have here, I wonder if you could touch on two basic things, because you said just a second ago, if it does escalate, if we do get beyond that point, the threshold, then all of a sudden the risk to civilization, certainly to the Western Europe and United States, all get put at risk. And two of the things that you talk about, I know we don't have time to get to them all, but if you could briefly touch on, I think it's called the Tsar bomb, and also this torpedo that you talked about, the unmanned underwater vehicle. Tell me the significance of those two things.
Okay, Gary, would you go to slide 36, please? There's a lot I haven't talked about, as you probably can tell.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on again, but we're running low on time, and I don't want to get you away with those.
That's okay. It's no problem. It's very clear to me that Putin is most concerned about the instability of American leadership. In my view, he has correctly determined that American leadership is largely uneducated, is capable of making reckless decisions, as we have in this case, and got into a war that was a war of choice. And now we don't know how to get out of it, and we can't even acknowledge that we've lost it already. Yeah. So we're going to kill hundreds of thousands of more people because our political leadership is trying to cover themselves with the public, so the public doesn't understand how reckless they were and how ill-considered their decisions were. So Putin is worried about the behavior of American leadership. And he has obviously determined that you can't trust American leadership to know what they're doing. And that is why he's been very concerned about U.S. missile defenses. He understands that U.S. missile defenses don't work, but he's worried that an American president might actually be silly enough to think that they could work, and that he might use nuclear weapons in the hope that the missile defenses could protect the United States or parts of the United States from a Russian retaliation. So Putin, I think, very thoughtfully concluded that what he needed was a weapon that even a totally moronic, uninformed individual could understand there's no hope of stopping. In other words, so this is a weapon. This is almost a Dr. Strangelove weapon to destroy everything on the planet. So if you show the next slide, that would be slide 37. He actually went to a lot of trouble to, this is a photograph from a video camera that, according to Putin, it was a staged scene where Putin was sitting at a table with these military plans in front of him, and supposedly a cameraman operating a video camera just happened to see these plans. If we go to the next slide, we can see the details of what was in the plan. This is a giant torpedo. If you look at the third rendition of the torpedo, I have a 6-foot man at the top of it. It's nuclear powered. It's launched from under a submarine because it's big. It's not just fired from inside the submarine. It's carried under the carriage of a submarine. It's nuclear powered, so it's got infinite endurance. And it has in the front left side, you can see an enormous volume for a potential nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon that could easily, I want to underscore, easily fit in this device would be a 100 megaton nuclear weapon that Russia has already demonstrated. If you take a look at the next slide, slide 39, this is the nuclear weapon that the Russians detonated in 1957. It yielded 57 megatons of yield. The only reason it was such a low yield is they substituted uranium, they substituted lead in the weapon where it would normally have uranium, and its total yield would have easily been 100 megatons, easily twice the yield that they got. So let me just give you a feeling for the scale of damage, that these nuclear weapons. Let's go to slide 41. There we go. This chart is a little confusing, so I'll take a minute for it. The blue areas inside the chart shows the areas where the blast from a nuclear weapon of given yield is 5 pounds per square inch or higher. So at the edge, it's 5 pounds per square inch. There's a wind gust associated with the blast of 120 miles per hour. Anywhere in closer, the wind speeds are much higher. The blast overpressures are much higher. The outer red annular area shows you the range at which roughly 10 calories per square centimeter is deposited on the ground by the light from the fireball. The light from the fireball is tremendously intense and will cause things to catch fire. Let me suggest that you go to slide 17, 17, if you can, Gary. Here is an example of what the fireball did at Hiroshima. In the upper left figure, you see the shadow of this metal pump wheel, against the background of the metal plate, and the metal plate has been blistered everywhere the shadow from the fireball did not exist. So the shadow area is an area that was not blistered by the light of the fireball. If we go to slide 19, here is a person who was burnt at a range where the 10 calories per square centimeter or so distance shown in the earlier slide occurred. People, of course, at closer range would have been much more severely burnt. In this particular case, this victim had clothing on that was a pattern of dark and light material. The light from the fireball set the darker material on fire because it absorbed the light from the fireball and burnt her skin. The lighter material reflected more light away and protected her skin. Obviously, this woman died shortly after the attack. So that's just I just want people to get a sense of how these effects can occur. So if we go back to slide 4.1 again, we can see the tremendous range at which nuclear weapons of higher yield will cause fires. So if we look to the rightmost large red circle, the 9 megaton nuclear warhead, we see that this thing sets fires at 22 or 23 miles from a detonation point. If we look to the upper left, a small 10 kiloton weapon, which behaves much like the 1 kiloton weapon, we see that the blast and fire distances roughly coincide. As the weapons go to higher yield, the area that gets set on fire grows more rapidly with the increase in yield. So let's go to slide 42. That's a photograph of the Tsar bomb exploding. I don't know the distance, but it could be 100 miles. But slide 43 is a diagram of a much lower yield weapon, 10 times lower in yield. And we can see the debris cloud easily rises to 25 miles. In the case of the Tsar bomb, it would have been 35 or 40 miles. And then the crown of the cloud spreads out easily 50, 60, 80 miles from and that crown is carrying potentially radioactive materials, causing due to a phenomenon called fallout. So in the slide 4.4, next slide, I have compressed to the right. I show you all of the weapon distances that I showed in the first slide, slide 41, next to the 100 megaton Poseidon nuclear explosion effects. So the Poseidon effects are vastly larger, going out to ranges of 50 or 55 miles, 50 or even 60 miles. Let's
so
take
that
a look.
obviously is underwater. So where might one of these be detonated, and what could be the impact?
The fact that it was underwater would make no difference. I mean, the energy released would be so great that the fact that there was water around it would be of no incidence of any kind. So let me show you in slide 45 what the situation in the US could be if the Russians launched such an attack. The Poseidon torpedo, and incidentally, Putin has talked about this directly. The Poseidon torpedo, I think I'm out of the Poseidon torpedo has the yellow area shows you the area that would be set on fire if the Poseidon torpedo swam up the Hudson and detonated somewhere near Manhattan. You can see half of Long Island would be completely destroyed. The lower left slide shows what happens if nuclear weapons were detonated in New Haven, Providence. These would be in the water. These weapons would just they don't have to get too close. And actually, in the case of Boston, you would not want to put it into the harbor in Boston. You'd actually put it in the area between Boston and Cape Cod, because you could do much more damage by setting the whole area ablaze. And the next slide on the lower right shows the general area that could be set on fire essentially immediately by the nuclear firestorms that would be created by these weapons. If we go to the next slide here, this is a radiation pattern, 46, from the 10 megaton nuclear weapon. I won't go into describing it because it'll be clearer in the slide 4.7 that follows. What this curve shows is the lethal radiation curves from a 15 megaton nuclear weapon detonated on Boston, and it's an assumed wind pattern, so the wind could blow it all out to sea, so you could have no radiation effect. But after the nuclear attack, you might have trouble finding out which winds were blowing where. And of course, this is a weapon that's about 6 or 7 times lower in yield than the Poseidon would be. And of course, it's a multiple number of nuclear weapons. And so this is what Putin wants American political leaders to understand, that this would happen to the United States, whether or not we have working missile defenses, whether or not we have ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles that could destroy Russian retaliatory forces, that this would be a result if every nuclear weapon in Russia could be destroyed by the United States, except for these Poseidon unmanned vehicles. And he's basically saying, don't think about it. This is not something you want to think about. And
right.
I
think the irony is, well, not really the irony, I guess, but the reality is that, of course, the same thing would happen, on the Russian side. If this happened, because we would certainly retaliate. And so Putin, again, proves to be right. Everyone would lose. And that's one of the reasons why I say it's just insane to even play around with these kinds of things, because let's say that it was just a fraction of 1% chance, but the consequence of that coming to pass is the elimination of life as we know it. Even if some people physically survive it, the life would never go back to what it was. So why would you even want to pretend with that? I don't understand the logic there.
Well, the situation. The situation is due to ignorance. I would say the situation is due to ignorance. In other words, it's the kind of political and military ignorance displayed by Senator Graham and Lieutenant General Hodge. And if the best military advice you can get is the kind of advice that General Hodge has given, is, I would say, I know a large number of very capable 3- and 4-star generals, and let me suggest that you use them instead of him.
Right.
Make sure your military staff knows what they're doing. And incidentally, I believe General Brown, I have had input from several very reliable sources. I believe General Brown is a very sound, intelligent, well-informed officer. So I think that's good.
Well, let's hope so. Yeah, he didn't seem to want to jump in to answer some of the ridiculous questions. So there's hope for that. Professor, before we let you go here, and just in the last little bit here, what is the consequence in those areas? Like the one we're showing on 47 there with these red lines. What is the consequence after the blast? How long before these areas are livable? What is the long-term consequences of this single episode here?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about long-term consequences of, you would not want to be in those areas many months after the attack. So the radiation does degrade very rapidly, but it's still, you would not want to be there because the radiation levels would be high enough that you would get residual radiation effects over time. And there would be a very great danger. The radiation comes in the form of dust particles, which contain radioactive materials. And those could get ingested by you in the air because these particles are very small. The wind would pick them up and move them around. They will be, settling down, and they'll be in the water. So if you have special protection, which I don't think makes life very comfortable, you could potentially be in those areas for weeks and for weeks, even, let's say a few months after the attack, but you would not want to stay. You could probably occupy these areas in a couple of years after the attack.
A couple of years.
Yeah. But
All
of
right,
course,
well,
they would be all burnt out.
Yeah. Well, on that lovely thought, we'll bring this episode here to a close. I mean, it sounds a little odd, but really appreciate you coming on today and giving us the truth, because we need to know the truth. Even if it's unpleasant, if it's ugly, we need to know the truth so that we know why we don't want to play with these kinds of possibilities and instead move towards the negotiated settlement and end the threat of nuclear war. That's the bottom line, I think.
Yes. And I think you have another example. I think my video screen is frozen. I don't know what you're seeing, but it looks like it's frozen.
Yeah.
And that's an example of artificial intelligence that people ought to be thinking about when they turn life endangering technologies over to machines. Because I have an artificial intelligence system that's supposed to manage how I appear on the video screen, and it's clearly gone out of function.
Well, it has. Well, let's hope that isn't the same system in charge of our nuclear weapons. But anyway, thank you very much for coming on again, Professor. We always really value these kinds of information here, and you give us information we just don't get on really almost any of the mainstream media anymore. So thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
And we thank you guys for coming on and joining us today as well. We always appreciate you, even when the subject is a little darker than some other times. You deserve to know the truth, and you can count on us. We're going to continue to give it to you because we are unintimidated and uncompromised when it comes to giving you the truth. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to come back again tomorrow like we usually do with our Friday wrap-up and show you the intel brief of things you missed. You can count on that tomorrow. I think it's at 2:00, but watch look at our channels, and we'll have that listed on there later. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.